Hello dear students, I hope you are doing well and are safe and healthy. Today we are starting chapter number 5, Popular Struggles and Movements of your book Democratic Politics Part 2. So far in the previous chapters, we have discussed the importance of power sharing in a democracy and how power is shared between different tiers of government and various social groups. In the same context, we discussed how those who exercise power are constrained by the influence and pressure exerted on them. I am sure by now you must have come to this conclusion that democracy almost invariably involves conflict of interests and viewpoints. These differences are often expressed in organized ways. Those who are in power are required to balance these conflicting demands and pressures. So, in the beginning of this chapter, we will discuss how struggles around conflicting demands and pressures shape democracy with the help of two case studies, one of Nepal and the other of Bolivia. Then further ahead, we will analyze different ways and organizations through which ordinary citizens can play a role in democracy. Not everyone can become active part of politics by joining a political party or standing in elections. There are other ways through which common people can influence the decision of people in power. So, in this chapter, we look at those indirect ways of influencing politics through pressure groups and movements. In class 9, you all studied about the success of democracy in Poland. Let us recall that story in brief. The Polish United Workers' Party, a communist party, ruled over Poland with the strong support of the government of USSR. On August 14, 1980, the workers of Lenin shipyard in the city of Gdansk went on a strike. Lech Walesa assumed the leadership of striking workers. Government was forced to enter into an agreement with the workers, which came to be known as Gdansk Agreement. The agreement provided freedom to organize, protest and express opinions. An independent trade union, Solidarity, was formed. It grew in strength. In December 1981, under General Jaruzelski, martial law was imposed. All the rights granted in Gdansk Agreement was withdrawn. Solidarity organized a series of strikes in opposition to the government's actions. Another agreement was signed in April 1989, which provided for free presidential elections. Walesa was elected President of Poland in October 1990. Thus, democracy came to be restored in Poland. This story reminds us about the role played by the people in making of the democracy. So, in this chapter, we will read about two more recent stories of this kind and see how power is exercised in democracy. Let us begin with our first story of this chapter, which is about the movement for democracy in Nepal. Nepal was one of the third wave countries that had won democracy in 1990. In May 1991, Nepal held its first parliamentary elections. King Birendra accepted constitutional reforms and established a multi-party parliament with king as the head of the state and an executive prime minister. Although the king formally remained the head of the state, the real power was exercised by popularly elected representatives. He was killed in a mysterious massacre of the royal family in 2001. His brother, Gyanendra, became the new king of Nepal, was not prepared to accept democratic rule. He took advantage of the weakness and unpopularity of the democratically elected government. This led to King Gyanendra being crowned king again in the midst of a civil war in Nepal. Towards the end of the year, the government and the Maoists had started engaging in peace talks, which soon collapsed. In retaliation, the rebels attacked military posts and police outposts across 42 districts. This led to a state of emergency being declared in Nepal. King Gyanendra cancelled the 2002 elections and appointed a new prime minister and dismissed the government. In the following years of 2003, 2004 and 2005, the Nepalese civil war continued. Many died at the hands of the Nepali military forces and the Maoist rebels. In February 2005, the king dismissed the then Prime Minister and dissolved the popularly elected parliament. Nepal then witnessed an extraordinary popular movement for restoring democracy in April 2006. This movement was aimed at regaining popular control over the government from the king. In April 2006, People's Movement was launched jointly by the democratic parties, focusing most energy in Kathmandu, which led to a 19-day curfew. All the major political parties in the parliament formed a 7-party alliance, SPA, and called for a 4-day strike in Kathmandu, the country's capital. This protest soon turned into an indefinite strike in which Maoist insurgents and various other organizations joined hands. Maoists are those communists who believe in the ideology of Mao, the leader of Chinese Revolution. They seek to overthrow the government through an armed revolution so as to establish the rule of peasants and workers. They were generally seen as rebels, and the king of Nepal and his government were scrambling to defuse the situation. The threats of the Maoists were confirmed when they started to attack factories and police outposts, ransacking and destroying property, and setting off explosives that took the lives of many innocents. People defied curfew and took to the streets. The security forces found themselves unable to take on more than 1 lakh people who gathered almost every day to demand restoration of democracy. The number of protesters reached between 3 and 5 lakhs on 21st April, and they served an ultimatum to the king. The leaders of the movement rejected the half-hearted concessions made by the king. They stuck to their demands for restoration of parliament, power to an all-party government, and a new constituent assembly. On 24th April 2006, the last day of the ultimatum, the king was forced to concede all 3 demands. King Gyanendra relinquished his power and reinstated the parliament. On November 21, 2006, Prime Minister Girija Prasad Koirala and Maoist Chairman Prachanda signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement (CPA) 2006, committing to democracy and peace for the progress of the country and people. A Constituent Assembly election was held on April 10, 2008. On May 28, 2008, the newly elected Constituent Assembly declared Nepal a federal democratic republic, abolishing the 240-year-old monarchy. In 2015, it adopted a new constitution. Nepal today has a president as head of the state and a prime minister heading the government. The struggle of the Nepali people is a source of inspiration to democrats all over the world. In the stories of Poland and Nepal, we find that the struggle of people was for establishing or restoring democracy. But the role of popular struggles does not come to an end with the establishment of democracy. Popular struggle is part of democracy, and this thought takes us to our next story. Bolivia is a poor country in South America. People here successfully struggled against privatization of water and thus reminds us of the fact that popular struggles are integral to the working of democracy. Let us hear about it in some detail. In 1997, the World Bank declared that it would stop providing Bolivia with international development grants unless the government of Bolivia gave up its control of municipal water supply and privatize it. The government, under this pressure, sold these rights to a multinational company for the city of Cochabamba. The company immediately increased the price of water by 4 times. Many people received monthly water bill of rupees 1,000 in a country where average income is around 5,000 a month. In year 2000, protests were erupted over the privatization of Cochabamba's water system and the subsequent rise in water prices. In particular, the protesters asserted their rights to have access to water, which they felt had been disregarded during the process of privatization. A major issue related to this conflict was the fact that poorest parts of the city were not receiving piped water whilst the richer parts were. In January 2000, a new alliance of labour, human rights and community leaders organized a successful 4-day general strike in the city. The government agreed to negotiate and the strike was called off. Yet nothing happened. The police resorted to brutal repression when the agitation was started again in February. Another strike followed in April and the government imposed martial law. But the power of people forced the officials of the MNC to flee the city and made the government concede to all the demands of the people. The contract with the MNC was cancelled and water supply was restored to the municipality at old rates. This came to be known as Bolivia's water war. These two stories of Nepal and Bolivia have many similarities and yet they are different. Let's talk about the similarities first. Both of them were political conflicts. The widespread struggle was caused due to unfair political decisions. In Nepal, the king tried to overthrow democracy, and in Bolivia, the government gave water rights to MNC. The second similarity is that in both cases, we saw mass mobilization, as both instances affected the entire population and together they decided to stand up for their rights. It was the mass mobilization that made those in power to comply. Public demonstration of mass support clinched the dispute. The third similarity is that in both cases, the struggles were led by political organizations like political parties, and pressure groups played a huge role in the mobilization of people. In Nepal, it was the 7-party alliance, SPA, and the Nepalese Communist Party, Maoist. And in Bolivia, it was an organization called FEDECOR, supported by the Socialist Party. Let us now understand the differences between the two movements. The first difference is the movement in Nepal took place to establish democracy, while the struggle in Bolivia reflected people's expectations of the elected democratic government. The second difference is the struggle in Nepal was about changing the foundations of the country from monarchy to democracy and its politics, whereas the popular struggle in Bolivia was about one specific unpopular decision of privatization of water supply taken by the government. The third difference is, though the struggles of both the countries were successful, their impact was felt at different levels. Throughout class 9, with the help of various case studies of different countries, we have seen that this is how democracy has evolved all over the world. So, we can now draw a few conclusions from all these examples. Our first conclusion is that democracy evolves through popular struggles. it is possible that some significant decisions may take place through consensus and may not involve any conflict at all. But that would be an exception. Defining movements of democracy usually involve conflict between those groups who have exercised power and those who aspire for a share in power. In Nepal, people had to go through very long struggle to first transition to democracy and then later to restore democracy. It didn't come easy. These movements come when the country is going through transition to democracy, expansion of democracy, or deepening of democracy. You will study more about these in the last chapter of your book. The second conclusion is that democratic conflict is resolved through mass mobilization. Sometimes it is possible that the conflict is resolved by using the existing institutions like the parliament or the judiciary. But when there is a deep dispute, very often these institutions themselves get involved in the dispute. The resolution has to come from outside, from the people. We saw this in case of Bolivia when its own government, under the pressure from outside organization, went ahead and took a decision of privatizing the water supply. That was detrimental for its people. If people had not mobilized in such large numbers, changing the decision by the government would have been difficult. Only because of the mass mobilization, the government could shift its priority from an economic decision to a social decision. Third conclusion is that these conflicts and mobilizations are based on new political organizations. There is an element of spontaneity in all such historic movements. But the spontaneous public participation becomes effective with the help of organized politics. There can be many agencies of organized politics. These include political parties, pressure groups, and movement groups. For example, 7 different political parties, namely Nepali Congress, Nepali Congress Democratic, Communist Party of Nepal, that is Unified Marxist and Leninist, Nepal Workers and Peasants Party, Nepal Goodwill Party, Unified Left Front, and People's Front came together to make a coalition and fight together to restore democracy in Nepal. In the above 2 examples of Nepal and Bolivia, you can now appreciate the role of organizations other than political parties in bringing the changes in their country. Let us study about these organizations and their role in making these struggles successful, taking the example of Nepal first. We noted that the call for indefinite strike was given by the SPA or the 7-party alliance in Nepal. As we saw earlier, this alliance included some big parties that had some members in the parliament. But the SPA was not the only organization behind this mass upsurge. The protest was also joined by the Nepalese Communist Party, Maoist, which did not believe in parliamentary democracy. This party was involved in an armed struggle against the Nepali government and had established its control over large parts of Nepal. Their ideology was different from its 7 political parties. It was not only the political parties but other organizations such as labor unions and their federations who also joined this movement. Besides these, many organizations like the organizations of the indigenous people, teachers, lawyers, and human rights groups extended support to the movement. The protest against water privatization in Bolivia was not led by any political party. It was led by an organization called FEDECOR. This organization comprised of local professionals, including engineers and environmentalists. They were supported by a federation of farmers who relied on irrigation, the Confederation of Factory Worker Unions, middle-class students from the University of Cochabamba, and the city's growing population of homeless street children. The demands in its core addressed unemployment and economic problems and were primarily directed at the government. This movement was supported by the Socialist Party, which came in power in 2006. From both these examples, we can see that in a democracy, several different kinds of organizations work behind any big struggle. These organizations play their role in two ways. One obvious way, or the direct way, of influencing the decisions in a democracy is direct participation in competitive politics. This is done by creating parties, contesting elections, and forming governments. Another way is by forming an organization and undertaking activities to promote their interest or their viewpoints. This is an indirect way of participation for those who may not have the skills to take part in direct political activity other than voting. This way, they can get their governments to listen to their demands or their point of view. Such organizations are called interest groups or pressure groups. Pressure groups are organizations that attempt to influence government policies but do not aim to directly control or share political power. We will study about them in more detail in the next session. So, dear students, in today's session, we studied about the role of struggles around conflicting demands and pressures that shape democracy with the help of two case studies, one of Nepal and other of Bolivia. From today's discussion of these case studies, we came to the following conclusions: that a democracy evolves through popular struggle, as we saw in the case of Nepal. Democratic conflict is resolved through mass mobilization, as we saw in both cases of Bolivia and Nepal, and that in a democracy, several different kinds of organizations work together than the political parties work behind any big struggle. One way of influencing decisions in a democracy is participation in active politics, and another way is through organizations called interest groups or pressure groups, about which we will study in the next session. Now, before closing the session, let's see your today's assignment. Question number 1. What were the results of popular struggle of Nepal? Question number 2. Mention any 3 similarities between the movement of Nepal and Bolivia. Question number 3. Mention any 3 differences between the movement of Nepal and Bolivia. Question number 4. Which were the major organizations involved in the struggle in Nepal? Question number 5. Which were the major organizations involved in the struggle in Bolivia? Question number 6. Describe in brief about the Nepal's second movement for democracy in Nepal. And last, question number 7. Describe in brief the popular struggle of Bolivia. With this, we come to end of today's session. Thank you and see you soon.